Your real estate agent calls you and tells you that your house didn't appraise. What do? Stay tuned. Okay, in today's extremely volatile market and kind of crazy market, the appraisals can be a big deal. So what is an appraisal, and how do you handle the entire appraisal situation when you're either buying or selling a house? So what is an appraisal? Well, it's supposed to be an objective assessment done by a third party of a home, whether it's the house you're selling or the house you're buying. And appraisers take into consideration things like the age of the home, the condition of the home, the location of it, and then some other market input or other market data. And then they come up with a value for that home. If you are involved in a transaction where the buyer is using a lender, more than likely you are going to be involved. There's going to be an appraisal. And the lender does this because they want to ensure that the loan is the appropriate value for that home. And so if that's the case in a transaction you're involved in, or when you decide to buy or sell, that's the case, then you are going to probably have to have an appraisal. Now, the appraisal process is not an exact science. Different appraisers go about their appraisals differently. Some things that you can probably count on them looking at is the lot and the home size. They're probably also going to look at the curb appeal, because remember, that's their first impression of the house. So that first appearance. They're going to pay attention to upgrades, additions to the home, the overall quality and condition of the property. Even if it hasn't been updated, they want to make sure it's been maintained. And they're going to compare it to other homes in the neighborhood to make sure that it's similar to the other homes, because sometimes you have an outlier where you'll have, a really big, huge, expensive home among all these little homes, or vice versa. And they are going to look at that because they're going to consider that when they think of home resale, and they're going to pull comps. So hopefully you get a better idea of what the appraiser is looking for or looking at when they are appraising a home. So what does it mean for the seller, and what does it mean for the buyer? Well, for the seller, the questions they generally ask me is, how long is the appraisal going to take? It depends. Anywhere from a half hour to 2 or 3 hours. And honestly, it's going to depend on the size of the home and the size of the lot. Now, they are doing, since COVID, there have been some appraisals, and I'll talk about it in a minute, that are done kind of virtually, and I'll talk about that, and those, then you don't have to worry about how long you might have to be there. So you should prepare for, that time range as far as appraisals. What can you do as the seller to make sure that your home is appraised fairly? A couple of suggestions, and I always tell my sellers this regardless. You want to have a list of all of your updates, all of your additions, all of your upgrades, right? And you want to, if you have receipts for those things, or at least can put a value to those, and have that written up for the appraiser to see when they come in, that's good, because they might not necessarily know the quality of certain things. Let's say, the quality of the deck that you put on, or the quality of the appliances that are staying with the house. So they might consider those things. In addition to that, you want to talk to your real estate agent and find out if there are homes in the area that are similar to yours that the appraiser might use for comparables, and if they were appraised low. Because if you're the seller, you don't want your house to be appraised low. So what you can do is talk to your agent about that She will help you find any houses like that. And then you want to have an explanation. You want to do some digging or some research, or if they're your neighbor, maybe you want to ask them, do you know how that was assessed? And maybe there was an issue in the foundation, or maybe there's an issue in the backyard, and that's why the appraisal is lower. And then when the appraiser comes in, you can kind of head that off if you think that perhaps that's a home that he or she might use for the appraisal. Another thing that you want to make sure you pay attention to, even though I already mentioned it, the curb appeal is going to be important. And this can be twofold, because since COVID, some lenders will allow something called a desktop appraisal. And when they do that, they don't actually come out to the site. They do it through pictures in the MLS and through questions and any documents that you have maybe to give them. And they will have an exterior shot. They might drive by without coming into the house. So you want to make sure that your exterior is, if it's summertime, that the grass is cut, that weeds are pulled, that shrubs are trimmed. If it's wintertime, you want to make sure that the sidewalks are, cleared off, and that there's not big icicles hanging from anywhere. So those are things that you want to keep in mind if you're being appraised, whether the appraiser comes or whether it's a desktop appraisal, which is not super common, but they can happen. When the appraiser comes to your house, you have to be careful, because you don't want to be viewed as trying to influence the appraiser. Some appraisers don't want any input. Others are very open to it. Sometimes it depends on how busy they are. If they don't have to go and dig up a lot of information, sometimes they will take everything you have to offer. But if you're there and they show up to the house, you can give them that paper. You can tell them a few things that you think might be important for them to notice, but then back off. You don't want to follow them around as they appraise. It makes them uncomfortable, and it's just not a good situation. So be friendly. Give them the information that you want them to have, answer any questions they have, but then let them do their job. If you're the buyer, you don't have as many things to worry about. You will probably end up paying for it because it's your mortgage company that is requesting the appraisal. There are some cases, and I have had sellers that do this, where they get an appraisal when they put their house on the market, just because they want to know, or because they're getting a loan for another house that they want to buy, and so they just go ahead and get theirs appraised. So if the seller has gotten an appraisal done already, it's up to you whether, and they offer that to you, it's up to you whether you use it. Then you don't have to incur the cost of it. If you feel more comfortable having your lending company, or your lending company might not accept it. But you probably will have to pay for that. And then the only thing that you have to do after that is wait to see what it comes back as. Now, the only other thing that is something to consider, some people in this market, especially if it's a very hot market, will waive inspections and will waive the appraisal, especially if they're coming in with cash. And if you're coming in with cash, you can decide not to have an appraisal because there's no lender involved. But that's something that you always want to give careful consideration to, because you don't want to overpay for a home. You should have an idea of, yes, this is what it was listed for. And if an agent was involved, that price is probably close to where it should be, probably. But if you want to know for yourself, get the appraisal done. But some people are waiving that in this market. Again, I would recommend that you talk to your agent about the pros and cons of doing that, depending on the market and the type of offer you're making. Now, there is something called an appraisal waiver, and only certain properties can be eligible for this. So it's something you can investigate if you have a lender and see what that takes. But it basically takes automated information, and it does kind of a value thing with that automated information. So the appraiser is not actually walking through your house. So again, that's something that you can talk to your lender about. Okay, so the biggest question is, what do you do if the house that you're buying or the house that you're selling does not appraise? For the seller, you have the option to drop your price to the appraisal and then you can move forward. Another option is that you can refute that appraisal. You can provide data and explain why you think that's wrong, but understand that depending on your closing deadlines and if the buyer is at all able to adjust those dates, refuting that and then providing the data and doing all of that is going to change some of the deadlines, and it's going to take some flexibility and it'll take some additional time. So that's another option. You can go back and try to negotiate with the buyer a price somewhere in between, or you can walk away from the deal. If you're the buyer, you can come up with the extra cash to get it up to that, because what's going to happen on the buyer side is they'll approve a loan for the appraised value based off of the appraised value, but it's going to drop then. So there's going to be a difference in what your offer price was and what you're going to be able to afford, or what the bank is going to give you toward that purchase. So if you have the cash, you can just put that, if it's $5,000 off and you have that extra cash, you can just put that, there at closing and be done with it. Again, you can negotiate with the seller and see if you can meet somewhere in the middle, or you can back out of the deal if the house doesn't appraise and you don't have the extra money to do that. In my experience, it always works out. It's always worked out so far, fingers crossed. Sometimes it's a negotiation situation. Sometimes the seller just decides to drop. Sometimes the buyer just decides to come up with the extra cash. But there are things to do if it doesn't appraise. So it doesn't mean that the deal is dead. Your real estate agent will advise you regardless of the side that you're on, but you can get through if the house that is involved in the transaction does not appraise. That's it for this week. If you have any questions, I am Sharon Rosa. You can email me at sharonrosa@kw.com. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Friday.